Hello, I'm Kevin Hong. I'm a partner at LYC Partners, an executive search and leadership advisory firm. I'm also the co-founder of The Council, a private network for senior executives. And this is Leaders in Motion. Today I'm joined by Francesco Pesci. Francesco is a seasoned luxury executive with over 30 years of experience across 4 countries: Italy, France, Denmark, and Japan. Most recently, he served as managing director at Lancel in Paris. Before that, Francesco was CEO of Georg Jensen, the Danish heritage brand, where he led a financial turnaround. Earlier in his career, he was CEO of Brioni, overseeing its acquisition by Kering and the brand's international expansion across Europe and Asia. In this conversation, we'll talk about what it really takes to bring a European luxury brand into Asia, how cultural understanding shapes market entry strategy, the rise of Chinese luxury brands and whether they can go global, and what Francesco sees as the defining challenge for cross-border executives navigating the world today. Francesco, welcome to Leaders in Motion.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you for having me today.
It would be great if you can give a short introduction of your career, your journey.
Yes, as you have outlined already, I'm a senior executive with more than 30 years of, career in the so-called luxury premium sector. Actually, I had a brief stint in fast-moving consumer goods at the beginning of my career before joining Brioni, which is a high-end menswear company, where I worked 10 years as a role, very much focused on Asia and Japan in particularly. And after that period, I joined Casa Damiani, which is an Italian high-end jewelry house, which gave me the opportunity of running a Japanese subsidiary in Tokyo for 2 years. And then I returned to Brioni as a menswear sales director, which is a role that I had for 3 years during a period which was a little bit challenging back then, because it was when the Lehman Brothers crisis actually took place in the United States. And after 3 years in that commercial role at Brioni, I shifted to a CEO, which is when actually my career shifted, from sales management to general management. As you have explained already, as a CEO of Brioni, I essentially oversaw the sale of the company to the Kering group. Back then, the group was called PPR. But also during that, people essentially executed a very, intensive transformation process of the company, and also delivered growth, thanks to retail expansion and product development. And after this experience as a CEO of Brioni, I briefly joined an Italian house called Pelleterie, which is specialized in down jackets, for about 1.5 years. And after that, I got in contact with Investcorp, which is a very large private equity fund with more than $25 billion in asset management, that back then was owner of Georg Jensen. Georg Jensen is a Danish heritage house founded in 1904. And that was also very interesting experience, for 2 reasons. One is what you have outlined already, which was the need to put the company back on track in respect to financial performance. The second reason was that at Georg Jensen, I experienced, how to, I would say, bring clarity to the complexity caused by the coexistence of very different product categories, because the company is specialized in jewelry and homeware and silver hollowware. And I would say that period was also complex because of the pandemics. So I could experience, the importance of growing the digital challenge, the digital channel, when actually the physical one is a shutdown. That also was a very professionally enriching period for me. And after that, I had a very brief experience as an interim manager in a completely different industry in Italy, which is the retail pharmacy sector. That was, this a little bit my fault of being intellectually curious, if I can say. And after that brief experience, I came back, to the premium industry by joining Lancel, which is a French heritage leather accessories house, where also I led initially a restructuring, intervention. And then in the second year of my tenure, the company came back to growth. So it was quite a significant case of return to profitability and growth for a house that had been, exposed to challenges for a very long period before that. So that's in a nutshell my experience, which I would summarize as a combination of a very solid initial sales management career and in the last 15 years, an equally solid experience in general management.
in Leaders in Motion, we like to talk about movements when it comes to career transition. So how would you, I would like you to go back into like some of the transition that really were like key points or turning points in your career.
Yes, I identify three, I would say, defining moments in my career. The first one happened when I was relatively young. I was 28 years old, and in 1995, my employer, which back then was Brioni, asked me to attend a training program organized, by the European Union, which is known still nowadays as executive training program. So I spent 18 months in Tokyo familiarizing with Japanese business practices, learning the language and understanding, the Japanese society, its values and culture. And that was actually a turning point in my career because for two reasons. One is it was the first time that I was exposed, to culturally a highly different, environment, because Japan, being an Asian country, is very, very different from Europe. But also that was a defining moment in my career because after that experience, my employer asked me to oversee Asia as a continent in general. So that is the opportunity that is the moment that provided me with the opportunity to really understand and explore Asia as a not only as a luxury business market, but also as a different cultural place to understand and appreciate. And the second moment was definitely when my career shifted, from I would say senior leadership, to general management leadership. That was back in 2010. I had been a salesperson, since the beginning of my career, and in 2010, owners of Brioni asked me to step into the CEO role, and that was not the first time that I was running a profit and loss, consolidated profit and loss, because I did that also as a country manager for Damiani Japan in Tokyo. Brioni was, sales-wise, not such a big company. Back then, 160 million euros of turnover, highly complex. It was a lot of internal production, 6 manufacturing units, about 1,800 people, a lot of them in the manufacturing operation. So really, really, that change required that I would be able, to work as a 360 degrees, general management, instead of only being focused on managing clients and commercial development and communication. And I would say there's a third moment, which I did not really expect, but at the end it turned out to be, which is when I accepted, to move to Copenhagen as a CEO of Georg Jensen. So Scandinavia also is, culturally speaking, very, very different, from Southern Europe. And this experience also allowed me to understand myself better. So really provided me for the opportunity of being 100%, I would say, myself. And then in Scandinavia, I would say I came to the point where I really know what my strengths are, obviously what my weaknesses are, and why I could actually thrive professionally in an environment as different as Scandinavia. I may add the fact that since 2014, I left menswear. And since then, in the last 15 years, I've been able to touch different product categories. Whereas until 2014, I was very much, I would say, a professional specialized in one product, one industry, one product category. The last 15 years of my career have allowed me, to really learn managing companies which operate in different product categories. So I have become much more adaptable as a senior manager.
Thank you. What do you think was the success factors that brought you to C-suite position? What the reason you could be a good CEO?
Well, of course, my experience in sales provided me with a very solid knowledge of what counts, in order to succeed at a retail level, but also at a wholesale level with B2B accounts. And another thing that really was important for me was that when I was in sales, I attended a lot of what they call in American English, which are made-to-measure shows, which gave me the opportunity of meeting final consumers. So I had a very, very solid understanding of what made a Brioni success with its customer base. But the reason why I could successfully step into a CEO role is probably instead linked to how I would say, my mindset work. because although I was in sales, I wasn't only focused on selling, but I understood since the very beginning the importance of understanding the function of the company as a whole. So I've always developed a very strong working, I'd say, collaborative relationship with the other functions, and I've always wanted to understand very deeply the impact of a decision happening in the commercial field on all other functions, which can be finance, which can be production, logistics, sometimes can be human resources. The reason why I could step into the CEO role is that essentially the senior management team back then identified me as the person who had the best, say, general understanding of the general functioning of the company. That's what it allowed me to step into this role and immediately, I would say, start working as a true CEO instead of just a sales guy that has casually stepped into that.
What do you think are the leadership traits or personality that are required to be a good CEO, in your opinion? And are there different?
Yes, a functional leader, essentially, you are very much responsible of a vertical. So you have inevitably you are focusing, I would say, on a more restricted number of KPIs. But also when you are in sales, for instance, you are inevitably strongly determined, to deliver sales, and that's one specific thing. So therefore, you only come in contact with a limited number of challenges. Now, when you work as a CEO, one of the things you need to accept is that essentially a CEO is supposed to deal with all difficulties and challenges that a company is exposed to. So sometimes, if I may say, the CEO role is less of a pleasant role, compared, to the role of a functional leader. And I would say that the most important quality you need to have as a CEO is this ability to make the company work as a collective organization, make the company work as a whole, and also act as a point of contact for all functional leaders that will need for your advice, will need for your help, will need for your guidance at a given point in time. And another thing that sets a CEO role apart from a functional senior leadership role is the need to develop very fast what is called emotional intelligence. Because to get people to work together requires you to understand people, how they think, but also how they feel. Sometimes how they feel plays a key role in how you can mix up people together in order to build a team. And a second quality I would definitely mention, and not a lot of people would tell you this, but in my humble opinion, a CEO is definitely expected to make clarity out of complexity. Today's business is complex, and complexity actually ignites concern. People are not happy with dealing with complexity. What a CEO needs to do is to analyze the situation, to make a synthesis, and then to communicate it extremely clearly, internally and externally, so people also become clear about what needs to do, when it needs to do, how it needs to do. And a CEO also needs to be close to the teams. That's another thing that, again, reflects my personal opinion. I do not particularly believe in a CEO role as somebody sitting in an ivory tower, strategizing and then expecting other people to execute. In today's complex world, you need to show from the front, you need to be close to the teams. And when things happen that will prevent the company from achieving its goals, which it will inevitably happen, you need to essentially tell the teams that that's normal, and then there will be another route to reach the goal anyway.
And when it comes to leadership, do you feel that different country culture would require a different approach to leadership?
I do not. Honestly speaking, I think that the leadership styles, differ, quite significantly. I believe a CEO today running a global company needs to be acutely aware of these cultural differences. There is a limit, to how much you can adjust. Because, for instance, myself as an Italian person, when I stepped into the CEO role at a Danish company, I said a very simple thing. I said, I cannot become Danish. That's impossible for me. But I need to know what is unclear to you when I take a decision, how I need to behave in order for me to be effective. So I will not become Danish, but I need to adjust my leadership style in order to thrive in a Scandinavian environment, which is what I did. Because, for instance, I learned that in Scandinavia, contrary to France and Italy, you need to take less of a hierarchical approach, and you need instead to prioritize very clear, transparent communication. You need to accept that Scandinavian employees essentially see you as a peer to them, an employee that has much more responsibility, but they are not going to follow you just because you have a title of CEO. You need to explain why things have to be done. Whereas if you work, for instance, in Italy and France, you take a hierarchical approach, and that's how generally companies work. Does it add up to complexity? Well, that of course depends on the size of the company. If you work for a very, very large organization, you will have different regions with very high ranking senior managers, each one running its own region. So you may say, okay, I have somebody in the United States, taking care of the Americans. I don't need to worry about this. But when you are running a company which is a mid-size, you have to manage this complexity because a lot will end up on your desk on a daily basis. So you need to know how to adjust your behavior, your communication style, and also how you, I would say, handle feelings that people express to be effective in different regions of the world.
What do you think that European leaders, when it comes to approaching different markets?
I would say that traditionally European brands have emerged in the luxury business, thanks to their heritage, thanks to their, I would say, product, not in all cases, but in quite a number of cases, and thanks to their product excellence, and also thanks to the fact that the European brands were conveying the European lifestyle to non-American markets, to non-European markets like the United States market first, the Middle East, or the Asian market. And those markets were years ago prepared to celebrate, the success of these European brands because consumers were fascinated, by the European lifestyle. And this is the playbook that essentially worked for a number of years. But the planet is changing fast, and the United States, well, this has been the case for quite a number of years, but especially Asia in the more recent period has emerged as a global powerhouse. And therefore, these markets are more and more sensitive to how a European brand is consistent, with local values, and how a European brand can resonate, with the local culture. And I believe that the European leadership needs to, when approaching, for instance, a market like Asia today and China in particular, my advice today is to take a start from zero approach. So really ask yourself whether what has made your success, the success of your brand so far in Western markets, is it going to be also effective in China or not? And that's a question that very often European leaders do not ask themselves. And in my humble opinion, this is a mistake, because you really need to ask, is my brand relevant, for Chinese consumers? Maybe the answer is no, or maybe yes, but I need to adjust a number of things, and then you have really to do these things. So that's what my advice would be for European leadership. So do not assume success anymore just because you are leading, I'd say, a European brand which is excellent because of its heritage, because of its product excellence, or because of its history in general.
The general impression, an opinion about what is happening. You mentioned China in the luxury sector.
Well, the fact of the matter is that in the last 20 years, essentially most, if not all, of the growth of the luxury sector was driven, by the soaring demand of Chinese consumers. And Chinese consumers, if I may say something, sometimes, people in this industry have a little bit of a short memory. So Chinese consumers in the last 20 years have behaved very much like Japanese consumers used to do in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. So there was a very strong demand coming out of a middle class that was, becoming more affluent, and therefore was very much oriented towards European luxury brands in order to convey its, I would say, status, its success, its higher education level. But inevitably, if we put aside for a moment the importance of the economic cycle, of whatever geopolitical factors you want to think of, what happens is that consumers become more sophisticated. And what's happening in China is very simple. China is the oldest, civilization on earth. So Chinese consumers are becoming just as sophisticated as anybody else on the planet, or perhaps even more sophisticated. Though therefore, it takes much more work to seduce them. That's the simple thing that is happening. So if I can resume it in a little bit of a blunt formula, I would say that we need to take Chinese consumers and Chinese society much more seriously than what we have done so far. We don't have to assume that they will like us, because we are a European brand. We need to make a very hard effort to understand what they are interested in, what they appreciate, and we need to adjust accordingly.
Do you think that European brands are ready when it comes to the mindset to embrace what you just mentioned?
I would say at the moment, some big names are doing it. I see a lot of, let's say, small to mid-sized European companies that still fail to, I'd say, accept the complexity of penetrating the Chinese market. So sometimes they underestimate the cost and the time that it takes, to establish a brand in China. That's a thing also not to be taken lightly. And that's the reason why anytime I come across a company that tells me we want to go to China, my first question is, how well prepared are your teams, in order to go into China? To answer your question, I think that a lot of companies need to do their homework a little bit.
What was your experience working with the local teams? Overall, working with the regions, and how often do you feel that they push back? They believe that they brand to push further when it comes to localization, that global does not really understand the local market, and to which extent sometimes you believe that they don't understand enough, to which extent do you believe that sometimes your team do not listen to them enough?
I have to go back, to my experience in Japan, because Japan, for instance, is a country where when you work as a country manager, essentially you are in top management. You express yourself questions, you express yourself, and I was expressing myself in the local language, so there was not a language problem. When you ask questions, you receive answers, and you don't understand, what people think. The most difficult thing in Japan is understanding what really people really think. And I said, how do I get, my employees to push back on what I say? Well, I had to adjust to a local method. I don't know whether that is still relevant nowadays, but essentially Japanese employees do not tell you what they think, in front of other people in the company. They tell you after the end of the working day. If you go out with them to have dinner and have a couple of beers, then they open up and you will know everything you need to know. Now, you can see that's completely different, from Scandinavia, where you say one thing and people do not hesitate, to counter your opinion publicly. Australians also are extremely open, and the United States also, my experience is very interesting. The United States is a place where people inevitably tell you all the time. They tell you, we can do this. It's very high positivity, right? We can do this. We can grow sales by 20%. We can do it. It's going to be great. You need how to apply a discount, to what they say, because the reality will always be a little bit less fantastic than what they tell you. But you should never tell Americans, you cannot do it. Because if you tell them you cannot do it, you're actually, saying that they are not capable of delivering you this fairy tale. And that's highly insulting, in the United States. Is there time where I regret when I think I didn't listen enough? No, actually, there is a time where I regret not fighting hard to get the board to understand what I had understood, which was about how Brioni should function in China. We had a fantastic franchise business in China with 3 local partners that were perfectly capable of understanding what needed to be done locally to sell the brand. We didn't understand it sometimes. But say, okay, we trust you guys, because you know how to sell Brioni to Chinese consumers. And the Kering group, forced me to take over the franchise network. And I think I should have battled, much hard to get Paris to understand that we, as a relatively small to medium-sized Italian company, did not have the capability of running an operation in China. That's a regret, because it had negative consequences on our commercial performance in China. Sometimes you need to accept that you do not understand, and you trust local teams not to deliver what they need to deliver.
Wow. You mentioned you didn't fight hard enough. Why do you think it has to be so much of a fight?
Because I've come to a conclusion. Because essentially, most people do not like complexity. And when there is a winning formula somewhere, they want to apply the same winning formula otherwise. So people do not like dealing with complexity. People do not actually like having to behave differently in the United States, in Europe, in the Middle East, in China. They will like, to behave the same way everywhere. So it's the human to like comfort. So why do I need to change, when I go to China? This is me. No, I need to change. And I embrace this complexity, and I ask myself why I've embraced this complexity. Because when I joined Brioni, someone in the company explained me very well, Francesco, the domestic market weighs 20% on our top line. The 80% comes from foreign countries, and you have to understand that when you sell to Germans is one thing, when you sell to English is a different thing, you sell to French is a different thing, the Americans are different, the Japanese are different. So I developed this mindset that every time I come across somebody that doesn't come from my country, the first thing I do, I listen. I try listening, and a lot of people do not. I will say they they would prefer not to do this. So that's why sometimes it becomes a heated debate. Why don't you do the same thing in China? Well, because China is a different planet in itself. So I need to rewrite everything I do in order to succeed in China.
As a CEO, what would you do, or what have you done to ensure or to facilitate?
Well, by winning recipes to get when you work with your colleagues, at the end, I get the people I work with to appreciate this complexity, because this complexity is professionally and intellectually enriching. So I tell them, look, but when we do things in a certain way in the United States, and then we have to do things completely differently in China, that's the great part of our job, because that's actually what makes us as human beings more open-minded. It makes us, I'd say more educated, and that's the best part of working in the luxury business. It's a global business that requires you to deal with very different markets, very different cultures, very different sets of values. And at the end, this is what makes working in this industry so fascinating. Contrary maybe to other industries where I'll give you one example. I started my career in fast-moving consumer goods, and you have the Colgate toothpaste, and you sell the Colgate toothpaste in the same way in the United States as you sell it in Italy. In luxury business, it doesn't happen like this. I remember having discussions about, the person in charge of the menswear collection at Brioni that expected Americans to dress up like Italians do. I said, that will never happen. What looks beautiful to you doesn't look beautiful to them. And that's great. That's great. So to get people to become, I would say, intellectually curious and open-minded is the trick I play in trying to have this inevitable level of complexity accepted by a global organization. You still need to make it clear to everybody what your company is about and what are the fundamental things that your company is not willing to change, because those define you as a company, as a lot of things define you as a person, Kevin. So I can expect you to adjust when you travel to Italy or France, but you will still be Kevin with your personality, and I need to respect that.
How would you build teams that will embrace this complexity, these differences? Practically speaking, what does it mean when it comes to hiring, when it comes to processes, when it comes to resolving conflict between departments, conflict between brands, conflict between regions and countries? What would you put in place when leading this?
Well, when it comes to selecting talents, I believe that nowadays it's very important to look at, if you need to build a senior leadership team that is able to embrace this complexity, you need to look for talent that has experienced this complexity. So the fact that, for instance, a senior manager has worked in different companies, different countries, or has maybe experienced different product categories, probably suggests this person is going to be more prepared to deal with complexity in comparison with someone that perhaps has had an exceptional career, but only in one industry and only in one country. Now, how do you resolve conflicts? Conflict is inevitable. At a given point in time, you need to get people to understand that the bottom line is really what counts. So what is the solution that will deliver the highest value is something that everybody needs to accept. Conflict will happen because sometimes are under the impression that you can deliver value in different ways, but then you as a CEO will arbitrate by choosing the path to delivering value, which also carries, the lowest level of risk. And people need to accept that this is your decision as a CEO and will need to accept your reasoning. You have to communicate your reasoning, though. That's also important. So sometimes when you arbitrate and you take a decision, you have to explain people, look, I've taken this decision, because this is how, not necessarily because this is how personally think things should be done, because this is how we can deliver value without, putting, the company too much risk. So that's the processes. Processes in general for the decision-making process. Processes can vary from country to country. I try to put in place, I would say, a decision-making process that provides everybody with the opportunity of speaking up his mind or her mind in transparency. And also I put in place one-to-one occasions, to interact, so I can really understand better what, the kind of feedback, the kind of message that I need to get, from the local markets.
What are today the biggest transformation points when it comes to the luxury sector, and that you feel like are the biggest challenge that are facing European brands today?
Not an easy question, but I would say I would highly recommend to senior management today in the luxury business. The first thing to do is to change mindset, to realize that the world in which we have so far had our careers no more exist. To accept the fact that in order for a luxury brand to succeed nowadays, we have to become much better in a number of fields, not only in one field. There's not a magic formula today. So today, in order to excel, you need to excel almost in everything to do. And I will give you one example. There's a lot of discussion on pricing today. I remember when I joined in this industry, I was taught a very simple rule, which is that if you are afraid of high prices, you should not be working in this industry. For a luxury brand to be pricey is somehow normal. But if you push it to the point where there's no longer a correlation between the product, or the integrity of the product, the quality of the product, how much the product will last, and the price you're asking for, obviously, the thing spirals out of control, and that will affect the credibility of your brand. Now, this behavior, which maybe was not punished 5 or 10 years ago, today is no more tolerated. So, for instance, how you manage your pricing today has become very important. How you manage your brand your brand storytelling externally, but also how you manage your teams internally has to be consistent. You cannot project a certain brand image and then you have people working in the company that tell a completely different story when it comes to how human resources are managed, for instance. These are things that affect the credibility of the brand, of a luxury brand today, and this is no more, I would say, forgiven by final consumers today. We were talking about Gen Z. I think that the luxury industry is not really looking at demographics. And a demographic tendency is something to look at very carefully, because essentially in all developed countries, populations is aging fast. So if we say on one side, Generation Z has imposed a digital-first approach, we also need to realize that with a very few notable exceptions, Generation Z in the coming years will not have the purchasing power to pay, for the prices that the luxury industry is actually asking for. Whereas on one side, it's understandable and necessary, to project a young image. We also need to, I would say, to make sure that a brand is relevant across multiple generations, not only with one generation, because as a matter of fact, most of your future consumers will not be so young, will be more aged. This is happening in the whole of Western Europe. It's also happening in China. In China, there is a demographic change happening quite fast that will change the face of this country in the next 50 years. And this is something to be taken into account. Look, when you talk about geopolitical challenge, I would say you do not control those. No brand control those. That we need to accept that we live in a much more unstable world, and therefore at the board level, at a senior leadership level, you always have to have contingency plans. This is how do I protect my company's business in case one important market, spirals out of control because of a geopolitical challenge. So this would be my advice to the industry. So accept that things are not as easy as they used to be. Accept that what worked yesterday no more works today, and get back to the basics, that are important to make any kind of business successful, not only the luxury business. So the question I ask is, what was needed in order for the brand to adjust, and why was the company unable, to implement those changes? Was the top management, listening enough, to the local teams, trying to explain, why the changes were needed? At the end, when a company should accept that if it's not willing, to implement the necessary changes, or if it does not have the means, to implement the necessary changes, then you pull back because you need, to protect your bottom line. But when you do so, and that's the important lesson I would like, to remind everybody to retain in his own mind. If you do pull back, from China, then going back, will be difficult, because the Chinese will remember that at a given point in time when the thing, when the going got tough, you decided, to quit, and nobody likes quitters.
When it comes to career management, what do you think is still true today that was true when you started, when it comes to a career in luxury? And what do you think changed, and what to pay attention to for the younger generation?
What still is true today for an authentic luxury brand, so for instance, for a brand that essentially has thrived because of its product excellence, is understanding that craftsmanship and creativity sits at the heart of this industry. So if you work in this industry as a top manager, you still need to make an effort to protect the product integrity, the craftsmanship, and the creativity, because that is what makes the luxury business, different, from other businesses. What is different today is that the world has become, as I said, wider, more complex, more unstable. So you need to be prepared to accept changes. Ideally, you should try to anticipate changes, but that's easier said than done. So I would advise somebody joining the luxury industry today to mentally prepare himself or herself, for the inevitable changes that will come, and when changes will come, to try accumulating, I would say, varied experiences, that make your profile more complete and more adaptable. It's no longer possible to expect in this industry to have his or her own career, only one single country, one single industry, one single company, for a lifetime. This is not going to happen anymore. And the best way to face up to this change is to enrich one's professional path, with different experiences, possibly in different countries, different product categories, different situations. So adaptability, and develop open-mindedness, and build a network. Network is very important, but that also applies to other industries. When I started my career, which was 30 years ago, there were plenty of people that had worked, for the same company for a very long time in the same country, and changes happened not so frequently. So the mindset was different, and the luxury business back then actually projected an image of security. Let's put it this way, security, because essentially people would explain you that the luxury business was selling very nice products to very affluent people, and therefore not much would happen, because affluent people always have the money, to afford nice products. We have seen in the last 15, 20 years that this industry can be affected by changes in a market. That's the case of China. Can be challenged, by decisions, by one administration imposing tariffs on other countries, geopolitical challenges. So unfortunately, the luxury industry, the industry is confronted with this difficulty also because of its success. Because 30 years ago, the luxury industry was not as globalized as it is today. Today, the luxury industry, being a global one, is subject, to instability and uncertainties, as historically global industries have always been in the economy.
I do have the impression that previous generation of leaders or current leaders today are a little bit more equipped with offline network. And today, the younger generation, digitally savvy, and they can nurture a digital network. but maybe not as much so offline network. But what do you think?
I think your point is your observation is spot on. One thing I've noticed, by looking at the behavior of younger generations, is that they have a much more frequent interaction with other people, and thanks to digital technology. That's without any doubt. They are looking at the screen of their mobile phone all the time, and they are chatting with somebody all the time. That they sometimes fail to realize that digital interaction is not as effective as a human interaction when it comes to building a true link with another human being. So therefore, even when I work in a company as a senior leader, I encourage younger people to mingle sometimes physically. So just I create occasions so that people can share a coffee or can share a breakfast together, because interacting is much more effective to get to know each other in comparison to interacting on a screen. And networking is becoming more and more important, because it is a way of countering the negative impact of this instability. So you may find yourself during your career in a situation where actually having a network of people that know you relatively well and appreciate you provides you with the opportunity of identifying new career opportunities when the need to do so arises.
Great. That's quite inspiring. Would you have any advice maybe related to that to the future generation of leaders?
For somebody embracing a career, from somebody, undertaking a career in the luxury business, I say, and it's very young today, I noticed one thing, that people, they look at this industry has, a lot of bells and whistles, everything is shining and everything is going to be great and everything is going to be fast, because the digital generation, by definition, appreciates speed. And the reason why younger people appreciate speed is that they simply grew up in a world where you push, the button on a screen and something happens immediately. When it comes to the luxury business, my advice to younger generations would be to understand that this is an industry that requires a very serious approach. You need to be prepared, to work hard, to work long hours. You need to embrace complexity, and you need to accept, that success sometimes can take longer than you expected. So I would recommend patience and application to be to their native digital capabilities. So their native digital capabilities are very important nowadays, but will not allow them 100% the success in this industry. It also take other qualities that they need to nurture and learn.
Great. I will close the conversation on this inspiring message. So Francesco, thank you very much for the discussion. That was insightful. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for having me and for the time we spent together. Also, I appreciated our conversation very much.
Thank you for listening to Leaders in Motion. And if you want to go further, join the Leaders in Motion Academy, our executive program. The first step is simple. Subscribe to our newsletter in the show notes, and you'll get access to our exclusive insights and all the details about the Academy. This podcast is produced by Melanie Hong, who helps leaders and organizations create strategic podcasts. I'm Kevin Hong, and see you next time.